think my channel is turning into a video diary of my deep dives into Hoya confusion and complexities. Hello friends, if you're new here, my name is Miro and welcome to my channel. Recently I got asked to do an update video on my Hoya sigillatis or sigillatis that I recently purchased, and I thought, quite naively, this would be a good opportunity to do a bit of a superficial research into Hoya sigillatis and see what I can find out about it. Of course, I was mistaken that this would only be a superficial research, and I was mistaken that I knew something about this plant. As it turns out, once again, I know nothing about this Hoya. My poor naive person was pulled into the mystery of sigillatis, but I did find out some interesting things in the end. First of all, let's start with the basics. This is definitely a Hoya. I can claim that, right? I can say this is a Hoya, and no Hoya experts can reprimand me for saying something that's not correct, unless they change the name of the genus. In that case, I am out of this Hoya nonsense. I am out. Please don't change the name of the genus, please. I'm already going crazy with this. Let's be serious again. Hoya sigillatis is native to Malaysia, to the island of Borneo. More specifically, it is native to the state of Sabah on Borneo, and that is on the northern part of the island. Now, why is this important? Well, because of the climate. By the way, my deep dive started because I was looking into the climate of Sabah. Don't ask me how I ended up where I did. I cannot give you the answer. Borneo has an equatorial climate, and during the night, temperatures can go all the way down to 20 degrees of Celsius, which is around 68 degrees of Fahrenheit, and during the day they can go as high as 32 degrees of Celsius or around 90 degrees of Fahrenheit. Now, in the inner parts of the island, it can get actually a bit colder than that, but because Sabah is located on the outer part, we will go by these temperatures. So this means that Hoya sigillatis would like to be kept warm. Some people say that it can go for moderate temperatures, but I wouldn't really do that. Based on my incredibly vast experience of growing Hoya sigillatis for 4 months, I can tell you that it does really well in temperatures that go from 21 to 24 degrees of Celsius, which I think is around 70 to 77 degrees of Fahrenheit. As I said, most of what I read suggests that this Hoya falls into some like it hot territory. As for the humidity, Sabah is a place that has a really decent humidity, anywhere from 70 to 95%, and in my growing space, in my grow room, the humidity is usually from 60 to 85%, and I actually try to keep it as low as possible, around 60-65, and it has been proven to be quite difficult, I know, for me. And the reason why I do this is because when you have a higher percent of humidity, you will need a fan or more fans. I already have one fan that is going on 24/7, and I think I would probably benefit from another fan. So for all of you who are going for highest possible humidity for your plants and you think they will do well, you must have a fan. Because trust me, if you don't have the fan, ugly things will start to show up. Another important aspect of Sabah is that it does get a lot of rain. They have a wet and a dry season. It is my understanding that their wet season is from November to March, and then all the other months it is dry season, but actually their dry season isn't that dry at all, so they will still get quite a significant amount of rain. So I guess it is wet and wetter. It is quite moist. I hate the word moist. What does this mean in terms of growing this Hoya? It means that Hoya sigillatis does not like to be kept dry. It can withstand certainly short periods of dryness, but as I told you, this plant doesn't really experience that in its native habitat. It wants to always be kept slightly moist. There it goes again. Moist. What this means is that you shouldn't keep your Hoya sigillatis dry and then let it go dry out for several weeks, because then what will happen is it will start to actually close its leaves. You can see now they're quite open, but they will actually bend, and now I cannot do it because it is getting enough water, but they will close up completely and they will kind of look like taco meets fortune cookie, but there is no good fortune inside. So I personally prefer to keep it well watered. So Hoya sigillatis is an epiphytic plant. It's a vining epiphyte, and it does really well potted in a net pot, in a cover pot, and in the non-homogeneous mix of sphagnum moss and bark, like I have it here. The orchid mix that I use consists mostly of bark. There are some other fillers in there, but make sure that when you are using the barky mix, from the orchid mix, that there isn't too much peat or cocoa peat, because that doesn't really work well in this situation. So try to go for pure bark and sphagnum moss if you're going to try this out, but I have to give you a disclaimer. What I'm doing now, this is an experiment. I'm still trying this out. I've been only growing Hoyas in this mix for about 5 or 6 months, so early days. When I pot my Hoyas in this mix, I will put a layer of sphagnum moss on the bottom, then I will put some bark, then the plant with the roots, and then I will add a tiny bit of sphagnum moss that will connect to the bottom layer, and then I will mix in the rest of the bark and sphagnum moss. So kind of that the sphagnum moss goes all the way throughout the pot, but the most is on the bottom, and there is very little sphagnum moss in the rest of the mix. So I would call this a predominantly barky mix. Another good thing here is that you can adjust the ratio of sphagnum moss and bark depending if you have a Hoya that wants more moisture or less moisture. Before I continue about the mix, I have to touch up a bit on the sphagnum moss that I use. Some people confuse sphagnum moss and peat. Even though they come from the same plant, sphagnum moss and peat are not the same, and there is a difference in the way they are harvested. Harvesting peat usually involves destruction of peat bogs, which is not a sustainable process. The sphagnum moss that I use comes from the company called Best Grow from New Zealand. This is not an ad for them, and it's not a sponsored video, but the reason I'm mentioning this is because I have been receiving a couple of comments about the usage of sphagnum moss and how sustainable it is. The company that produces this sphagnum moss actually harvests it from specific areas that are actually intended for harvesting sphagnum moss. They cite that all of their moss is sustainably harvested and it is a renewable resource. Their product is registered in New Zealand, and it is very different than Chinese moss and the Chilean moss, and I will just leave a link down below to their company and you can find out more about them if you want to try out using sphagnum moss but you are worried about sustainability, which you should be. And that brings me to another point. In regular mixes that you buy in garden centers, a lot of them have peat in them. As we mentioned, peat is not sustainable. So what you can do is you can mix your own mix from coco coir. You can put perlite in there, worm castings, and that should be a good mix for your plants. You can add bark, or you can also try to grow plants in leca, which should be a more sustainable way in growing plants. I'm working with leca right now. I'm trying out leca. I'm trying to grow more and more plants in leca because I think it may be a better solution than some of these potting mixes that we use. I don't even know how much is bark sustainable, so we kind of have to work a bit on that too. But now back to the video, and let's talk about the mix that I use and why I use it. Well, as you know, most Hoyas are epiphytic plants, and this means that they grow attached to the side of the tree. That means that they will not encounter any regular potting mix that we sometimes put them in, and also their roots will receive a lot of air, a lot of ventilation, and they will receive a lot of rain too, but they will dry out much faster. Oftentimes, I see that people avoid watering their Hoyas because they're so easy to rot, and again, they go weeks and weeks without watering them, but this is not something that they would naturally experience. I do know that I talked about this before, but I just feel the need to mention it again because I see it happening again and again and again. Any epiphytic plant is prone to root rot, some more, some less. So you may get away with potting Hoyas in a mix that is not as airy, but if you try that with some orchids like Cattleyas, Phalaenopsis, and Vandas, if you pot them in a mix that is not airy, you will not get away with that. And they are also epiphytic plants as well. When I pot my Hoyas in the mix that you can see here, so it's bark and a bit of sphagnum moss, I give them water every 4 to 6 days. And I will quickly notice if I miss a watering that they will start to look a bit dehydrated. I do understand that some people don't have time to water their plants every 4 to 6 days, but I'm telling you how I grow my Hoya. This mix is extremely well draining, and most importantly, it is very airy. In my opinion, airy and fast draining are not the same. Cacti mix, for example, is well draining, but it is not something that I would call airy. I know that some people use it for Hoyas too. In my opinion, it is not an airy mix. There is sand, sometimes there is clay in this mix, so I personally would not use it for my Hoyas. Of course, you can do with your plant whatever you want. Maybe it will work for you. I certainly am not willing to try that for this plant. Anyways, this video is not about mixes, it is about Hoya sigillatis. If you want me to make a separate video on mixes to maybe try out some of the more commonly used mixes for Hoyas so we can see how fast they drain and how they look like after several days after they're watered, let me know down in the comments below. The point of the potting mix story is to talk about watering. Who would have known? There were so many digressions that I almost ended up talking about the meaning of life. This also gives you a better insight on how my internet researches go. I start looking into Hoyas and the next thing you know, I end up watching videos of baby hippos. By the way, did you know that hippo's closest relative is whale? We don't know anything, people! Back to Hoyas again. I know I already said that, I know. As I mentioned, I water my Hoya sigillatis every 4 to 5 days, and I don't let it completely dry out. Now it's a good time to water this Hoya. When I touch the moss, I can still feel that it's slightly moist. But when I look at the side, I can see that the top and the most of the pot is actually dry. The mix is quite dry, so it would be a good time to water my Hoya. In fact, I may do it in front of the camera. What is this sexy thing, you may wonder? It was featured before, my giant tank that I used to water my plants with. So I'm going to show you how I water this Hoya. There is water inside, you just give it few pumps, more than that, and I really don't pay too much attention if I will get the foliage wet. I never had any rot issues in this mix, so I will just, you can see the water, I will just quickly water it, and you can see it is already starting to drain instantly, I would say. So I will return it in the cover pot, and I will let the moss to soak in the water that remains in the cover pot. I will leave the excess water in the cover pot. I will not create a Pacific Ocean in the cover pot. It will be just a tiny amount of water. The excess water that is left in the cover pot will be absorbed by the moss, and if it's a Hoya that likes more water, I will give it a bit more water, so that means that the moss will stay moist a bit longer. And if it's a Hoya that doesn't like so much water, I will give it, of course, less water that will also be absorbed by the moss, but it will dry out much faster. And we can check and see. So the water is almost absorbed by the moss. Really, there wasn't too much. And you can already see, it's not that wet, so the water will be distributed by this moss around the potting mix, and then the roots will not get too much water. They will get just enough water that they need. I will just add a bit more. Oh, I still need the Hoya. I think Hoya sigillatis is best grown as a hanging plant. When we look at it, it really does seem that it would do best like that. Unfortunately, I don't have so much hanging space anymore, and until I pierce my ears so I can hang them here, it is staying on my plant shelf with LED lights. You can see that it is quite a bit away from the light because it's not very tall plant. The leaves are not turning that red. They are slightly more reddish, but you cannot see that on camera. You can see that in person. They're slightly more reddish than when I received it, but overall they are still not sun stressed for now. When I received this plant, it was in coconut husk, and I had to remove that because it's not something that works really well in my environment, and I did damage some roots. Many people ask me how can they do this without damaging the roots. I really don't think there is a way. You can try to minimize the damage, don't pull the living life out of your plant. It is okay if you damage some of the roots, the plant will recover, it will recuperate. Also, what I'm noticing, there is a lot of new growth here, and I also took one cutting for my friend. I find that it is actually quite easy to root in distilled water with some algamic. That is how I root my Hoyas. Now, the true question is, where did I end up with my Hoya investigation, hoyastigation? I'm going to put down my Hoya and remove this sexy tank. As I previously told you, Hoya sigillatis is native to Borneo, to the state of Sabah. It was published in 2004 by Ted Green in Ferterna, which was then the official bulletin of International Hoya Association. It is my understanding that Ted Green was visiting Borneo and he came across this plant in Tenom Agricultural Park in 2004, which I believe now is called Sabah Agricultural Park. And he noticed that this is an unpublished Hoya. Now, it is not known who actually collected this Hoya and who brought it to this agricultural park, but we know that it was Ted Green who published this Hoya. I think This is the subspecies that Ted Green published. Later in 2011, and be prepared, I'm about to butcher two names, Linus Gokusing and Nyongir Lombika collected a Hoya in Beluran, Sandakan division, in the valley of the river Paitan. This Hoya was published in 2014 in Sandakanya, and it has the name Hoya sigillatis subspecies paitanensis, getting the name of the subspecies after the name of the river. I don't know how that Hoya looks like and if it's any different in the terms of the leaves or the flower, but I do believe that the one that I have is the same subspecies that Ted Green published in 2004. Now, of course, Hoyas wouldn't be Hoyas if the story ended there. You thought it was over? No. Through my very good friend in Sweden, I found out there exists a clone of Hoya sigillatis that doesn't have these silver spots on the leaves. Actually, through a bit of chit-chat, I discovered there are possibly 5 or 6 or more clones of Hoya sigillatis, and they look different than this one. For example, there is Hoya SPUT011, and if we take a look at this Hoya, the shape of the leaf looks different, there are no silver spots, and the flower also looks a bit different in color. It has the same characteristics that the flower of Hoya sigillatis has, and it is possibly Hoya sigillatis too, but it is very different in terms of the leaves than this Hoya sigillatis. There is also a Hoya in circulation that is comparable to Hoya sigillatis, and it has the accession number NS07-039, I think, and this one was collected by Natalie Simonson. This Hoya is supposed to have a bit of a pinkish flower. I'm not sure how the leaves look like because I don't have this Hoya, unfortunately. Not yet, at least. It is my understanding that people are not completely certain if this Hoya is different than Hoya sigillatis. It may be or it may not be. So it's not affinity, but it's comparable to Hoya sigillatis. There is also another clone of Hoya sigillatis in circulation that was collected in the valley of the river Alas. For the rest of the clones, I don't really know, but this brings me to another very important point. We cannot identify Hoya by leaves. I actually don't identify Hoya at all. The leaves can sometimes look very different, so we have to wait for the flower to see what is the correct ID. For example, how would you have known that Hoya species UT011 is a sigillatis? No way to know until you see the flower. Well, we finally arrived at the end of the video, and wasn't it a journey? In any case, I hope that you enjoyed the video and that you found out something new about Hoya sigillatis, or something that was interesting. For me, it is still early days in terms of growing Hoya sigillatis, so I will keep you updated a bit more on how it does if I have any issues. So far, it has been very easy Hoya to grow, but I do know that some people have had issues with this Hoya. And that brings me to another point. If you have Hoya sigillatis, let me know down in the comments below. Do you have any issues with this Hoya? Is it growing well? And did you bloom this Hoya? I did read that it takes a bit long to bloom this Hoya. If you take a look at Doug Chamberlain's website, Vermont Hoyas, he says it took him about 3 years to bloom Hoya sigillatis. Of course, I did not bloom mine, and I don't hope to do anytime soon. But of course, I would love to see the flowers, and if you did, if you were one of the lucky ones, leave a comment down below. If you liked this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up. If you're not subscribed to this channel, it's very easy. I subscribe to channels all the time. Very manageable. If you want, you can also support me on my Patreon, and the link to that is in the description below. I hope you're all having a wonderful day with your Hoyas. I hope they're growing well, despite it being a bit darker and despite that the winter is approaching, and I will see you very soon. Bye! I would like to take a moment to thank my wonderful patrons. A huge shout out to my glorious $5 patrons, Betsy Begonia, Kathy L, Melissa Walker, Nicole Ferranti, Vicky Dingler, and one anonymous patron. And a big shout out to my super cool $3 patrons, Becca Panyard and Nikki. Thank you all so much for your support. You're supercalifragilisticexpialidocious, but I'm not Mary Poppins. I'm pretty sure that I can say that though. Anyways, I have to go now, and I will see you really soon. Bye!